overemphasize nutrition. Even though this is a lecture on nutrition, I would like everyone to understand that nutrition is one of the 8 natural remedies. Does that make sense? And if you only follow one of the 8 natural remedies, you will not have health. Does that make sense also? I've had people come up to me and they say, well, I've been a vegetarian for 60 years, but they're totally out of shape and they're like overweight and they can't breathe and stuff like that. And that's not going to help you. So I think it's important for us to understand that this is a component of the health message, but of course, it is just one component. And God is a God of balance, right? He is interested in our lives, not just spiritually, but mentally, physically, emotionally, financially, right? In every way, he is interested. But I would like to go to the body. When you look at the process of digestion, where does it begin? It's a trick question. I heard the right answer. I heard the right answer from the back. Where does it begin? It's not the mouth, actually. I hear smell. I hear a lot of different things. It actually begins in the mind. Did you know that? Imagine for a moment if you are sleeping and someone is downstairs baking fresh apple pie. Do you think that that food stimulus would somehow enter into your mind? Yes, it would. Have you noticed that even just thinking about food can begin the digestive process? And of course, all of you are correct in your other answers. Our smell, our sight, right? Like if you look at food, right, that can also stimulate the digestive process. But when you consider that it is in our mind that it begins long before food even touches our lips. Did you know that there is a very interesting design when you look at the process of digestion, when you look at our bodies, and it begins even before the mouth? If you look at your hands for a moment, right? What do you think they're designed for? Do you think they're designed for ripping and tearing meat? What do you think they're designed for? They're designed for actually touch discrimination. Yes, picking is correct. Now, I'm going to use a word that maybe some of you don't know. Does anyone know what a homunculus is? That's a very large word. It's not something you need to know, but it is a graphic depiction of where the nerves of our brain are dedicated. So in other words, if you look at a depiction of the human body in relationship to the number of actual nerve cells or neurons dedicated to that part of the body, you would have this funny stick figure sort of guy. And he would have big giant eyes, he would have big lips, a big head, huge ears, he would have small little arms, a little trunk, he would have giant hands. Does that make sense? Because there's way more nerve cells dedicated to the eye, to the lips, to the hand, to especially the fingertips. And it's a disproportionate amount of nerve cells dedicated there. So when you look at our actual brains, there's huge amounts of cranium, so to speak, dedicated to your hand, to your finger pads especially, to discriminate the difference in textures, in touch. Now, when you look at the animal kingdom, like flesh food, what difference is there in texture. It all tastes like chicken, right? It's all very similar in texture, and it's also very similar in color. But when you look at the plant kingdom, how many varieties of texture do you see? A vast array. Look at the differences in colors, right? Did you know that the human eye has one of the best spectrum for color vision of any animal on the planet? There are some animals that have sharper vision, but as far as the appreciation and discrimination of color, our eye is one of the best. And if you look at the varieties of texture and color in the plant foods, there's no question that we, in terms of our actual brains, our eyes, our finger pads, are designed to enjoy that variety. It's very interesting when you look at other organisms, like if you consider a flower, for example. A flower, how does it reproduce? How does it survive? Pollination, right. What sort of things pollinate it? Bees, birds, insects. Did you know that those organisms don't even see the colors? Isn't that weird? They actually see the reflected ultraviolet light, but they do not appreciate the color as we do. In fact, they don't appreciate the color, the shapes, the things that we enjoy flowers for. Because why do you enjoy a flower? Tell me why you like flowers. Smell, what else? Color, shape, variety, texture, okay. Geometry, symmetry, right? Did you know that if you have a square dish that reflects ultraviolet light and you put sugar water there, that those same organisms will come to it? So the flower is designed not for its mere reproduction, but for who? For you. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. And I believe that the same is true when you look at food, when you look at our design. So digestion, the design of humanity, begins long before the mouth. It begins with the finger. It begins with the mind. It begins with the distribution of nerves. It begins in the color of your retina. Does anyone know what cones and rods are? Do you know what I'm referring to when I say cones and rods? Cones, yes. Cones are the color receptors. And we have basically more cones than anyone else. It's phenomenal. Now, a cat has a lot more rods than we do because a cat can see when? At night. And technically, a cat cannot see in the dark. If it's absolutely dark, even the cat can't see. But if it's just a few photons of light, it has a very high concentration of rods. So it can see and move around even in relative darkness. But as far as cones, nobody beats us. And I believe that that's for a purpose. But now let's get to the mouth. When we find the mouth, we discover teeth, right? What do you suppose our teeth are designed for? Well, we have not just one, not two, not three, but did you know we have 4 rows of molars? What's a molar for? Grinding, exactly. For chewing, grinding, for grains. If you look at our teeth, they're not designed for animal products. They're designed for plant products. In fact, the coup de grace, the absolute argument in the human mouth, is that in our saliva is something called salivary amylase. And that is an enzyme that is specific to plant carbohydrate. Very interesting. So you have your teeth that are designed for not ripping and tearing, not meat, but for grinding, for chewing. They're designed for plant foods. When you go to our stomach, you find the same phenomena. To digest proteins, you require acid. And there's a long process behind that. The hydrochloric acid is to convert trypsinogen to trypsin to trypsinogen, but you don't need to know that. But just know that the more protein you eat, especially animal protein, the more hydrochloric acid you need. Now, when you compare our stomachs to a carnivore stomachs, who do you suppose has more hydrochloric acid? The carnivore does. But try 10 times the hydrochloric acid. That's amazing, isn't it? And then when you look at other phenomena in our body, when you consider the amount of bile that is normally produced, it's not a large amount. We're not actually designed for a large amount of fat in our diets. In fact, when we start eating a lot of animal fats, we have to produce way, way more bile. And what do you think we end up getting? Gallstones, right? When you get a high concentration of something and then you take away the liquid in that solution, you get rock candy, right? That's how you make rock candy, is you have a super saturated solution and then you boil off what? The water, right? And then you crystallize what's in the solution. And that's the same thing with a gallstone, right? If you have someone that has a high concentration of bile and then they get dehydrated, right? What's going to come out of solution? The gallstones. When you look at carnivores versus the human intestine, consider for a moment, if I were to cook you a meal, let's say I'm going to cook you chicken cacciatore, right? And I said, I've been working all day on this meal for you, and I have the chicken, and the chicken's been sitting out thawing all day. Would you eat the meal that I was making for you? And now, why not? Come on. It's really good. What would you be afraid of? Yes, you'd be afraid of food poisoning because bacteria multiplies very well in animal products, right? If you think about what promotes bacterial multiplication, it is a warm, dark, moist place. And when you think about the insides of our bodies, they are warm, dark, and moist. And when you look at the length of our intestines, who do you think has a longer intestine versus a shorter intestine? The humans not only have a longer one, we have 300% the length. Did you know that? Because for the carnivores, they want the food to get in and out. Does that make sense? In and out. But for human, we are designed for absorption. In fact, we have very extensive little finger-like projections in our intestines. Have you ever heard of villi? Villi are little finger-like projections in the small intestine that increase the surface area of our digestive tract so that we can absorb more. And on those villi is something very interesting. And I will tell you a true story. I get a lot of food poisoning or flu and things like that in my job. And the person's vomiting, they have diarrhea, they're totally miserable, and they're usually quite dehydrated. So I will rehydrate them, give them medicine for the vomiting and the nausea, and sometimes for the cramps and stuff like that. And once I've got them hydrated up, one thing I do before I send them home is make sure that they can tolerate what? Some sort of fluids, exactly, because I don't want to send them home, right, vomiting, because they'll just wind up back in the ER. So I want to make sure that they can tolerate some sort of oral nutrition. So what do you think I give them as a trial? Yeah, something simple like water, right? Something simple like water or an electrolyte solution. And what do you think I tell them in terms of advice for the next few days? Yes, exactly. I give them a simple diet. Like maybe I might even start off with clear liquids, right? And then they progress. But you know what's funny? I see people come back and I've told them all this stuff and they say, Doc, the virus is back. I got the food poisoning back. The first time I ate, I started throwing up again. And you know what they ate? Pizza. It's just like, really? And why do you think they started throwing up again? It was too heavy. It was too complex, right? When your intestine has been infected, it is actually worn off the lining of the inside of your body, and it slowly grows back. And it's very, very fascinating because it grows back via the simplest to the most complex. You know what the last thing to grow back on your intestine is? Lactase. You know what lactase digests? Milk. You know what I think is very fascinating too? Is when you look at the activity of the lactase enzyme, it is very, very active until about after age 2. Anyone know why? What are we supposed to eat when we're little? Animal products. And specifically, which animal product? Your mother's milk. Why do you suppose that enzyme activity drops way off after age 2? Because you're not designed for that anymore. You're weaned. Isn't that cool? I think that's amazing. You know, we're the only animal that keeps drinking another species' milk after we're weaned. It's kind of strange, isn't it? But if you look at the design of our body, we're not designed to continue doing that. Now, of course, there are certain people groups where the lactase persists. It's very pronounced in people who are Dutch, Scandinavian, things like that. More Northern Europeans have the persistence of the lactase enzyme. And does that make sense why they do? Because that's a big part of their society, their culture, their diet. So the body has tried to accommodate for that kind of against the design of the body. And if you consider not just that, but what does everybody have to, not everybody, but usually have to have removed when they turn 18 from their mouth? Their wisdom teeth. Any wonder why we lose that 4th row of molars? Have you ever heard the phrase, if you don't use it, you lose it? Now, if you're not eating a plant-based diet, what are you not going to be stimulating? Yeah, those molars. Does that make sense? And so the body, after generation of an animal-based diet, there is no use, right? Our jaws begin to shorten because there's just no stimulus back there. It's all toward the front of the mouth. Does that make sense? So there's many things in the human body that point us toward a plant-based diet, but there's a lot of arguments against it, right? Because where do you get your protein? Have you heard that? Well, let me share. If you were to ask Patrick Babomian where he got his protein, this guy is a power lifter and he's vegan. In fact, he was Germany's strongest man in 2011, and then after that, he made records in powerlifting after he became vegan. Where does he get his protein? Well, where does an elephant get its protein? Where does a gorilla get its protein? Where does a horse get its protein, right? Isn't that interesting? So when people ask, where do you get your protein? You can get it from whole grains, beans, and nuts. Those are very rich sources of protein. Because when you take in animal protein, there are some negatives that come with it. Anyone know what people group eats the most protein in the world? Where's Bennett? I think Bennett's here somewhere. No, I think maybe he's with the young people. The Eskimos. Who said that? That's correct. It is the Eskimos. The Eskimos eat up to 400 grams of protein a day. But did you know that that protein, although it is very rich in calcium, right? They're eating bone and a lot of this fish and walrus and whatnot. Even though it's very rich in calcium, they have one of the highest incidences of osteoporosis in the world. Doesn't that seem strange? Well, the reason is when you eat animal protein especially, the body cannot deal with the nitrogen component. The nitrogen component has to be detoxified and gotten rid of. And have you ever seen the lab test that comes back with your electrolyte says BUN? Have you ever wondered what that was? It actually stands for blood urea nitrogen. It's a waste product of protein metabolism. And so when you eat protein, especially animal proteins, your body has to detoxify that. And the actual proteins in the animal foods are higher in cysteine and methionine, which are acidic amino acids. So the body has to buffer them, right? It has to neutralize the acids. And what do you suppose it uses to buffer them? Calcium. Where do you think calcium comes from? Your bones. That's right. So they've done studies where people take in large amounts of animal protein and they actually are leaking calcium in their urine. So it doesn't matter how much calcium you're taking in, it's the calcium balance that matters. Because if you're spilling it in your urine, then it doesn't help you. Does that make sense? So the higher the animal protein, the more calciuria, or loss of calcium in the urine, they found. When they repeated the studies with with plant proteins, you did not have that calciuria-induced protein loss. I mean, the protein-induced calciuria. The other issue is with animal proteins. Has anyone ever heard of the China diet study? T. Colin Campbell. He actually has a huge book, a huge group of data that show that as animal protein consumption goes up, cancer development goes up with it. It's a very direct correlation. In fact, if you eat just whole plant foods and you get enough calories, you will get enough protein. It is very difficult on a whole food diet to not get enough protein. So you should get more than enough protein just by eating whole plant foods. In fact, people who are elite athletes and distance runners do better on a plant-based diet. Did you know that? Actually, it's people say, wow, that's a lot of carbs. It's extremely high carb diet. Sixto Linares is a 3-time Ironman champion. Does anyone know what the Ironman is? It's a triathlon, right? Where you are going to swim, run, and bike like huge distances. It's a very grueling event, and he was vegan. There are many distance athletes that are vegan. Does anyone know what sort of diet they put people with kidney failure on? It's a low what? Low protein. And the reason for that is that your kidneys, again, have to detoxify the nitrogen. The nitrogen is turned into urea and ammonia, and the body has to excrete it, has to get rid of it. And that's the concept, is that if you want to save the life of a filter, either add more water or don't give it as much junk to filter. Does that make sense? Otherwise, you damage the filter. Also, when you eat animal protein, along with it, you get a large dose of cholesterol, right? Which plant foods have cholesterol? None of them. It was a trick question. How about nuts? No, they don't have cholesterol. You also get a large dose of saturated fat. when you eat animal proteins. And the interesting thing is, when you eat plant proteins, it's the opposite. You know, there have been studies that have shown that if you eat 25 grams or more of soy protein a day, it actually protects your heart from heart disease, heart attacks, things like that. But here's another argument. Vegans don't get enough calcium. Have you heard that? Milk, it does the body good, right? So where do you get your calcium if you're a vegan? Sure. Yeah, and that's the concept. You guys already know. When you drink milk, although milk is very high in calcium, it's also high in what? Protein, which causes you to lose the calcium. It's also incidentally high in phosphorus. And with calcium metabolism in the body, what's more important is not the amount of calcium, but the calcium to phosphorus ratio. Have you heard of that? The calcium to phosphorus ratio. When you look at the component of bone, you don't have to remember this, but the principal component of bone is calcium hydroxyapatite. It's a big word, isn't it? But what that molecule has is it has more calcium than phosphorus. So it's not the amount of calcium, but the ratio. Does that make sense? So when you look at a glass of milk, the calcium to phosphorus ratio is 1 to 1. And it also has a big dose of animal protein. When you look at dark green leafy vegetables, what do you suppose the ratio is? Like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 5 to 1. Collards are 7 to 1. Isn't that great? So you're getting the same amount of calcium in a cup of collard greens versus in a cup of milk, but you're getting a lot less phosphorus, and you're not getting any animal protein, and in fact, you're getting a whopping dose of magnesium along with the greens, and that is very important to retaining calcium as well. But maybe you've heard this. If you don't eat meat, then you're going to be anemic, right? You got to eat that big red steak, right? Did you know that that red steak is one of the most toxic things you can eat? Is that they found that the iron, especially the heme iron, or the iron that's found in blood, and the reason why that steak is red is because it's got blood. Does that make sense? So that form of iron is directly toxic to the heart, and it shortens your lifespan. So it's better to actually get iron from plant sources. And what are plant sources of iron? Sure. Green leafy vegetables. Someone mentioned spinach. Anything else? Raisins, figs, yes. Carob. Did you know carob is a very good source of calcium? What else? I said carob. Sorry. Yes, carob. So carob, blackstrap molasses. Have you heard of that? Yeah. So there's a lot of good sources of iron. And does anyone remember how to make your body absorb more of the iron? Yes, vitamin C. Yes, very good. You guys were definitely paying attention. But here is the winning argument against the vegan diet, right? Because there's no B12 in the vegan diet. Have you heard that? Sure. Let me tell you this. If that were the case, then every cow on the face of the planet would be vitamin B12 deficient. You laugh, but I'm being serious. This is such a funny argument that people use because there are many animals that are vegan, but did you know that all mammals need vitamin B12? It's not just you and I, but it's other organisms. And where does vitamin B12 come from? This is a trick question. Does it come from plant food? Does it come from animal food? Neither. Who said bacteria? You guys are so smart. It comes from bacteria. Vitamin B12 is cyanocobalamin, and it is synthesized by bacteria. So it's actually a misnomer to say, well, it's in plant foods or it's in animal foods. It's cyanocobalamin. It's from bacteria. And so when you look at vitamin B12, they have done studies on actually organic versus commercially grown produce. And did you know that there's a little vitamin B12 on the actual organic food? Isn't that interesting? I think that's very intriguing. But of course, animal foods do contain vitamin B12 because that animal needed the vitamin B12. Does that make sense? And also bacteria are much more apt to grow in animal foods as well. When you also look at vitamin B12, did you know that you can actually have vitamin B12 produced in your mouth? Do you know how? Bacteria. There are tons of bacteria in your mouth. That's why you hear people say, don't brush your teeth until after breakfast. Have you heard that? Get your vitamin B12. In fact, there are other sources of B12, and you can get it in, have you seen the yellow nutritional yeast flakes? Have you seen those? But some people say that those technically aren't vegan, but I consider that totally acceptable. That's fine. And in fact, there is an abundance of B12 produced in the body. You know which part of the body? There's tons of B12 produced, not just the mouth. Yes, the gut, the large intestine. That's absolutely right. But then the proponents for animal products say, yes, it is produced in the large intestine, but you can't absorb it there. Where is B12 absorbed? Does anyone know? It's in the small intestine. It's in the terminal ileum. There's the duodenum, the jejunum, the ileum. You don't need to know that unless you're like a physician or some sort of health professional. But it's absorbed in the latter part of the small intestine. But there's tons of it in the large intestine. And did you know recently they've actually found that there is some reflux in the ileocecal valve? Now that seemed like a very large mouthful. But what I'm saying is that the valve between the small intestine and the large intestine, they found that some of it comes backwards sometimes. Isn't that interesting? And so it carries with it a fairly large dose of bacteria and B12. But did you know what is there to mop up the bacteria? The appendix. They always used to say that the appendix is some evolutionary remnant. Have you heard that? That is so false. Don't do that. Don't just take out your appendix. Like they used to say that about the spleen. The spleen has no function, right? But then they found out, oh, wait a minute, don't take out your spleen, because if you do, then you get these nasty encapsulated organisms like different pneumonias, right? Then they said, well, your tonsils don't do anything, right? Your appendix doesn't do anything. But they found out that those are actually part of your immune system. Did you know that? Yeah, don't just clip those out willy-nilly. They don't grow back. So the interesting thing is that the appendix is there at the ileocecal junction as an immune tissue. Because did the good Lord know there'd be a little reflux from that area? Of course he did. And he prepared for it. He designed for it. It's not an evolutionary remnant. Anyone remember this? Fat is bad, right? But we know that that is false, right? They did an experiment on rhesus monkeys. Does anyone know why they use rhesus monkeys for experiments? As far as genetically, they are the closest mammal to us in the earth. So they did these on rhesus monkeys. So they try to extrapolate this to humans. They fed them avocado fat and dairy fat. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to keep the amount the same, right? Calories the same, grams the same, and to see what the difference is. Because they used to say a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. Have you heard that? A gram of fat is a gram of fat is a gram of fat. That's all false now, by the way. It is different. It is absolutely different. In fact, they have different effects on your body. In this experiment, although they accidentally gave the avocado group too many calories, despite that, the avocado group had 30% less abdominal deposition of fat than the dairy group. And people say, well, it doesn't matter where your fat is distributed. Ask any woman if she thinks it matters where her fat is distributed. It absolutely matters. And in fact, it doesn't just matter for women, it matters for all of us. Did you know that? Where is the worst place to deposit your fat? The abdomen, yes. Have you heard of the different types of obesity? There's the apple obesity. There's the pear obesity. Which one is the worst? The apple, right? When you distribute fat on your torso and abdomen, it is related to every single disease, basically. You've heard of syndrome X, you've heard of hypertension, you've heard of diabetes, right? All those are related to abdominal deposition of fat. Cancers, same thing, abdominal deposition of fat. And avocados and other plant fats, specifically monounsaturated fats, they actually shunt fat away from your midsection. And I don't even work for the avocado growers of Canada or whatever. I don't work for the olive growers either, because that's another monounsaturated fat. But what about the saturated fats? Aren't those really bad for you, right? Well, let's talk about what a saturated fat is. It just refers to the chemical structure of the carbon chain. C is carbon in that picture, and saturated means that each carbon has a fully saturated hydrogen component, right? So they're completely surrounded by hydrogens. All four of their bonds are taken up. Can you see that in the top one? Right there? Top one? Well, right there. I can see it on my picture, but I don't think anyone can see mine. But the bottom one has a little double bond there. Do you see that in the bottom? It's not fully saturated. So that's just the difference between saturated or unsaturated. And the thought process is that saturated fats are very harmful. But we went over that, right? Coconut has what? It has saturated fat, but why is it not bad for you? The majority of it is myristic acid, and it's a shorter chain fatty acid. So the body actually absorbs it directly instead of sending it to the liver and creating this molecule called a chylomicron to carry it. And it's the creation of the chylomicrons that raises your cholesterol through the roof. That's why dairy fats and animal fats raise your cholesterol like no tomorrow. Whereas the coconut, which is mostly the shorter chain, does not do that. And they're finding in some small studies, in pilot studies, that the coconut actually is helpful for some forms of dementia. So stay tuned. And also there are fats in nuts, right? Nuts are extremely high in fat, but as we know, the consumption of nuts is actually good for you. But do you remember how much nuts you're supposed to eat? How many? Yeah, just pretty much a handful, right? Anyone know what that nut is? It's the macadamia nut. Remember, the good Lord put 2 shells around the macadamia nut because it's the highest fat nut? I think that's cool. Here's another myth. Have you heard that carbs are bad? I mean, people are always down on carbs, right? I'm going to share with you a true story. I was in a potluck line one time, and one of the very popular carbs is the baked potato bar, right? So there were these 2 girls ahead of me going through the line, and the one in front took the baked potato and kind of mashed it down, and then she slathered it with butter, and then she slathered it with sour cream, and then she scooped some cheddar cheese and started shoveling it on top of there, and then she took all these other high-fat stuff, and finally the girl behind her said, "Girlfriend, you might as well slather that on your thighs." So it's not the carbs, it's what you put on the carbs. Does that make sense? A piece of whole grain sprouted Silver Hills bread, right? I'll happily plug them. They're very healthy bread, is very good for you. But what do you put on top of it? Does that make sense? Do you put like pure sugar or pure fat or like a lot of animal products? That's the issue with the carbs. But a piece of homemade whole grain bread is actually a healthful carb. Did you know that? It's very good. I've been enjoying some delicious homemade bread at the Coleman's every meal. It's very, very healthy. And do you remember what's also good about the unrefined grains? You get what along with it? Fiber, right? Many benefits to fiber. We talked about the full plate diet. And I just want to review again. If you say to a diabetic, "Here, have a piece of fruit," right? They're going to freak out. But they don't have to freak out, right? Because the sugar from that fruit is more slowly absorbed, even though it's the same amount of calories. Apple versus applesauce versus apple juice. Why is the apple more slowly absorbed? The fiber. And then the applesauce has a little less fiber, so it's a little bit more rapidly absorbed. And then finally, the juice is the most rapidly absorbed. Why? Because there's no fiber. Now, people have asked me, several people, they've said, well, is juice bad for you? Is oil, are you anti-oil or whatever? And I tell people, refined foods aren't evil, right? They're not evil. But if you eat refined foods in abundance, there are consequences, right? The Bible itself in Deuteronomy 32, 14 to 15 says, curds from the cattle, milk from the flock, fat of rams of the breed of Bashan, goats with the choicest wheat or refined wheat, and you drank wine, the blood of grapes, so juice, right? And what was the result? You grew fat. You grew thick. You are covered with fat. I'm just quoting the Bible. That's what it says. So if we eat too much refined things, we will get too many calories. Does that make sense? So you have to be careful not to go crazy with things that are refined. I mean, honey is a good thing, right? But it's very concentrated, right? It's very refined, and there's no fiber, right? So the Bible actually cautions us to eat just enough. Okay, how about we move from food to what's the ideal beverage? Water. What about soda, though? Isn't soda good? I remember one of our pastors shared that he would go on his visitations, and these families would drink like 3 cases of Pepsi a day. It was unbelievable. And I'm just like, wow. So what is wrong with drinking soda? Isn't a little soda good for you, right? Well, the sugar is a problem, and the sugar is empty calories. Did you know that when you eat refined sugar, it actually drains your body of B vitamins? Because when you eat carbohydrates, it has to run it through what's called the Krebs cycle. Does anyone know what the Krebs cycle is? It's basically the metabolism of carbohydrate, and it needs B vitamins at several parts of that process. But the sugar is actually just no nutrition, right? There's no vitamins or minerals. That's why people who drink alcohol get vitamin B deficiencies, because they're getting all their calories from that, and so it drains their body of the B vitamins. What else is not a good thing with soda? It's got some acids in it. What kind of acids? Carbonic and phosphoric, yes. Have you ever left a tooth in a glass of Coke before? It dissolves it, right? It eats it up. What else is not a good idea with soda? Sodium, yes. I haven't heard the biggest one, really. Caffeine, right? So we talked about caffeine as a stimulant. We're going to get to that in a little bit later. But did you know, I will tell you, there is one soda that I do advocate. Everyone's listening now, right? Did you? No, not that though. That's funny though. I should say that. Did you know that there are 2 naturally carbonated springs in my country? In the United States, there are 2 springs that actually bubble up carbonated water. And my friends who have been there, they said the best soda you've ever had is to bring some pure fruit juice and mix it in with that, and it is the best you've ever had. And people say, well, why are they carbonated? Apparently, there's like a reaction with the limestone, then it comes through, and there are 2 springs that are naturally carbonated. I haven't tried them yet, but I'd like to someday. Well, what about milk? Doesn't milk do a body good? Isn't that a good beverage to rehydrate you? It actually isn't, because of the protein in it. The protein actually pulls water out of your body. Did you know that? If you have 100 calories of protein versus 100 calories of carbohydrate, to process the protein, it takes 700% more water to process the protein because of the nitrogen and things like that. So milk is not good as far as the calcium, but it's also not good to rehydrate you because of the high animal protein. How about this for a beverage? Isn't that good? No? What's wrong with this? Well, caffeine is a big issue, right? In fact, I'm going to give you a confession, okay? I'm from Seattle, right? Seattle has the Puget Sound, right? Near it. That's the body of water near Seattle. They have actually done studies now on the Puget Sound, and the levels of caffeine in our water are getting so high it is disrupting the fish's reproductive cycle. And people are like, how does caffeine get in the Puget Sound? Anyone guess? Yes. The people drink so much Starbucks that it's actually excreted in their urine and carried out to the Puget Sound. It's massive amounts of caffeine consumption. So yes, caffeine is not good for you. In large amounts, caffeine can actually cause arrhythmias. Atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter are very common, but that's a large amount of caffeine. I mean, that's like glasses and glasses, like almost a pot a day. So most people don't drink that much. But caffeine also increases very slightly the risk of certain bladder cancers, as well as theobromine, which is in chocolate. But then people argue and say, well, but caffeine decreases colon cancer. I believe that the reason why they're seeing a decrease in colon cancer because people drink coffee and they have a bowel movement, right? Because it's a stimulus. That's my thinking of what's going on there. Does anyone remember what happens with one serving of a caffeinated beverage and your melatonin production? It cuts it in half for like 2 or 3 days. And how many people who drink caffeine only drink one serving every other day or every third day, right? Many of us are walking around at a quarter or an eighth of our actually melatonin production. And melatonin is actually very important for your body's circadian rhythm, and they're now finding for your actual longevity. They're starting to call melatonin the youth hormone. How about alcohol? Did you know that both alcohol and caffeine are diuretics? Do you know what a diuretic does? It actually dehydrates you. It pulls water from your body. But didn't somebody say that moderate alcohol is good? Haven't you heard that? Right? Isn't a cardiologist saying, yeah, you got to drink 1 or 2 drinks a day. It's good for you. And the reason why they found that was the French study showed that the French have less heart disease. So they were thinking it was the wine, right, that they drank. But then they found that the component that was heart protective was actually just in red and white grapes, just underneath the skin of the wet and white grapes. But you can get that by eating the grapes, right? Don't get the alcohol, because when they repeated the study with just alcohol, it didn't protect your heart at all. In fact, it was toxic to your heart. Don't do that. But let's take a look and see what God says about it. Wine is what? A mocker. Intoxicating drink arouses brawling, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. But wait a minute. Didn't the Bible say that wine was healthy a little bit? Right? Remember that verse in Paul's counsel to Timothy, right? Right? Don't drink just water, but use a little what? Wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. I had one of the pastors at camp meeting talk to me about this, and he's like, how do I deal with this statement? And the concept is that in the Bible, the word wine can be fermented or unfermented wine. And people say, no, if you look at the Greek and the Hebrew, you don't see that or whatever. I don't need the Greek and the Hebrew. Did you know that? I can prove to you that that is the case in Isaiah. Isaiah 65, verse 8. As the new wine is found where? In the what? The cluster of grapes, right? So that's obviously referring to grape juice. Does that make sense? Because it's in the actual cluster of grapes. And one says, do not destroy it, for there is a blessing in it. So will I do for my servant's sake. Even the container you drink out of makes a difference. And I'm sorry to have to say this, but yes, it's better to avoid the kind of porous plastic. And obviously it's better to drink water, than no water at all. But have you ever noticed that you leave that plastic water bottle in the back of your car in the sun for a while, and then you drink it, and what does it taste like? Plastic. Because some of it dissolves in the water. So what I recommend, if you have a water container, that it be not plastic. You could use stainless steel, you can use glass and then coat it to protect it. Because what happens is when you have temperatures that go up or down, it increases the dissolving of the plastic into the water and creates chemicals called dioxins. And those have kind of an estrogen-like effect. So try, if you're going to have a regular water container, try to make it glass, stainless steel, or if you absolutely have to use plastic, make it the real hard plastic. Does that make sense? Because that's less soluble. But ultimately, the bottom line is pure water is best. Here's another myth. Have you heard people say, I eat only one meal a day? All day long, right? Have you heard that? That's actually not true. If you eat more meals, you have increased risk of colon cancer. Did you know that the lowest risk of colon cancer goes to 2 meals a day? Isn't that interesting? There's also recent literature from the dentists. Has anyone ever heard about the flow in your tooth? There's a flow from the inside of your tooth to the outside of your tooth. Have you heard about that flow? It goes through little tubules in the dentin. Has anyone heard about that? And when you eat a sugary snack, it stops the flow of the inside of the tooth to the outside for several hours. But did you know what they've found? They've actually found that it doesn't matter what you eat between the meals, it stops the flow. They said, in fact, that it could even be like a grape or something like that. It stops the flow for a little while. And their conclusion is that people should eat regular meals with no snacks. In fact, they estimated to have the proper flow from the inside to the outside of your tooth, you needed about 5 or 6 hours between meals. Who said that? Ellen White said that. Anyone know when the worst time it is to eat? Well, yeah, I'll give you an idea. Most of us, right, are in a hurry before work, so what meal do we skip? Right? There we go. So that's usually what we skip, but that's actually the most important meal. I'm going to use an illustration of what this does to us by giving you the story of a group of athletes. Does anyone know what sumo wrestling is? Now, does anyone know what country this is from? Japan. Now, traditionally, are Japanese people large people or small people? They're small people. But the sumo wrestlers are huge. They manage to override their genetics through lifestyle. And you know how they do it? I'll show you. They become massive, huge, gigantic, because for breakfast they eat nothing. And for lunch, they eat a big meal, and you know what they do right after lunch? They sleep. Siesta. You know when they eat their biggest meal? Late at night. And they go to a place where they can eat a lot of refined foods and fat, like McDonald's. And did you know that there are some people in Japan that go to McDonald's not to eat, but to watch the sumo wrestler eat? Because they actually consume massive amounts of calories and fat late at night. And guess what they do after that? They sleep. Now, when we miss breakfast, right, we eat lunch, and what does everyone want to do after lunch? Take a nap. And where do we traditionally eat our largest meal? For supper. What do we do after supper? We relax and go to bed. Brothers and sisters, we are the sumo nation. And if you eat like the sumo, I'm sorry, you will look like the sumo. It's not good for us to eat the majority of our calories at night. It's better to eat them for your first meal. Does that make sense? In fact, Dr. Cupp had an interesting study over several years of his patients. He had an interesting prescription, and all he did was he told his patients to start eating a big breakfast. Isn't that weird? That's all he did. Start eating a big breakfast, eat a good lunch, and skip supper. And he found that not only did his patients lose weight, those that were anemic improved, and people on thyroid medication actually reduced or got off their medication. Isn't that incredible? What I tell people is it's good to eat your largest meal in the morning, not just for that reason, but if you skip breakfast, you actually lower your metabolism. By eating breakfast, you raise your metabolism by 25% versus those who don't eat breakfast. How about this myth? Never come between a pregnant woman and her chocolate, right? You should let a pregnant woman eat whatever she wants. Have you heard that? Isn't that true? Is it safe to go by our feelings when we choose what we eat? Did you know that pregnant women actually develop a disorder called pica? Has anyone heard of that? Where pregnant women crave eating ice and dirt. Do you think that that's a good indicator of what she should eat? I mean, obviously not, right? So your feelings, your cravings are not always a safe guideline to what you should eat, right? In fact, do you remember folic acid in pregnancy? They used to say that if you're pregnant, you should supplement folic acid. Did you know that they changed that now? Then they said if you're planning to get pregnant, you should eat folic acid supplementation. Now they say any woman of childbearing years should be supplementing folic acid. Now, why do they say that? Because of neural tube defects, right? Spina bifida, anencephaly, right? Do you think that prenatal care is important? You know, God does too. And he told us prenatal care was important long before science did. You shall conceive and bear a son. Now therefore please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, and not to eat anything unclean. I am proud to say that on my medical boards there was one question on nutrition about microwaves, if you can believe that. And the question was, John is a 47-year-old bachelor who microwaves all his food. What nutrient will he most likely be deficient in? Not all of them. I heard someone say all of them. That's funny. But for some reason, folic acid is very sensitive to microwaves. But yes, other nutrients are too, but folic acid is especially sensitive. So microwaves will destroy that if you only eat microwave food. Here's an interesting concept. Has anyone ever heard of epigenetics? That is a very fascinating field. And does anyone know what telomeres are? Telomeres? Anyone have shoelaces? Anyone have shoelaces on their shoes? Do you know the little plastic ends of your shoelaces? What are those for? They're to protect your shoelaces and prevent them from what? Unraveling. Those are telomeres to your DNA. So the telomeres are the ends of your chromosomes, okay? And for many, many years, they felt that these telomeres were markers of cell aging. They just got shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter until the cell died. But just recently, they put a group of men who were at low risk for prostate cancer, and they put them on an interesting lifestyle. They put them on a vegan diet. They got them walking 6 days a week. They got them to deal with stress. They got them to get enough sleep, drink enough water, and they showed that they lengthened their telomeres. They actually got longer. Amazing, amazing. That's just a small study, but it has gone against all of the conventional wisdom. So there are many reasons to eat plant foods besides just being healthy. Have you ever heard of people saying, well, I don't want to create a carbon footprint? Have you ever heard someone say that? They don't want to use up resources and stuff like that. Anyone know what Revelation 11:18 says? It says that God will destroy those who destroy what? The earth. So we should consider the environment in our choices. But of course, the people are the most important thing to God, right? On the planet. That God would trade in the whole world for one soul. Here's another argument for eating plant foods. Is it the animal rights argument? Have you heard that? Right? Jesus loves me too. It's invincible theology. So if you don't have to kill, right? If you don't have to survive by killing another creature, why would you? Does that make sense? So if you can be healthy and you can have nutrition without taking the life of someone else, hey, that's a good idea, right? Here's what I would like to close with. Does anyone remember the two components of the curse? Remember the curse? Before sin, what was our diet? Fruits, nuts, seeds, grains, beans, right? And so God gave that originally to us to eat, but then what did he add in Genesis 3:18? He added two things: vegetables and not just exercise, because we had exercise before, right? We were supposed to take care of the garden even before that, but what kind of exercise? Vigorous, sweating. And can you see that that's not really a curse? God has given us vegetables. He's given us vigorous physical activity to combat the evil of sin. Does that make sense? And not just the effects of sin on our spirit, but the effects of sin on our bodies, right? The most powerful lifestyle agents against disease, cancer particularly, is vegetables and vigorous physical exercise. Coincidence? I think not. But I'd like to close with my favorite verse from the Old Testament. Because for me, yes, I enjoy learning. I enjoy understanding the principles of God and how he has created our bodies. But you know what the important thing I want to know is? I want to know why. That's the most important thing for me, because in medical school, I had to learn all kinds of stuff, and a lot of them said, just memorize it. There's just too much. But I find that when I understand why, I can remember it. Does that make sense? And I want to share with you God's motive for giving us these commandments, for giving us the health message. It is not just to say, hey, I'm God and you got to follow me, right? Deuteronomy 6:24, the Lord our God commanded us all these to keep his statutes, to love the Lord our God. For whose good? For his good? For our good. How often? Always. What's his goal? That he might preserve us, how? Alive, as it is this day. And that's my appeal to you. God has given you a very, very precious gift in our health message. He has given you the boundaries of happiness so you know what is good, so you know what is bad, so you know what's going to strengthen your body, and so you know what's going to tear it down. I think about it this way. One time they did an experiment on a bunch of elementary school children. They had a playground which was fenced in. And in that playground, they had a sandbox in the middle, they had a merry-go-round, they had a swing set, they had a jungle gym, they had all kinds of equipment fenced in this playground. Now, outside of the fence, there was a river, there was a baseball field, there was all kinds of other things outside of the fence. And one time, without telling the kids, they overnight removed the fence and they let the kids out for recess. Because they thought, well, maybe the kids would go out to the river, maybe they go out to the baseball diamond or whatever. And did you know what the kids did? They all congregated in the sandbox, in the middle of the playground. And they were afraid to even use the equipment on the periphery of the playground. Why? Because they didn't know where the boundaries were anymore. You see, God has given us his laws so that we have peace, so that we have assurance to know what is good. And the most amazing thing is that God tells you to do these things, not because he's Almighty God, but because it's for you. It's for your good, always. How many of you have friends that you ask advice from? Raise your hands. How many of you have a friend who always gives you advice just for your good and they have no conflict of interest for their own interest? Anyone? A few. That's God. God wants you the best for your life. Not for himself, but for you. And it's not 50% of the time. It's not the majority of the time. It's how often? Always. Because he's trying to keep us alive so that he can bring us back home to heaven, brothers and sisters. That's the purpose of the health message. Not to live forever on this world, but to live forever in heaven with Jesus. How many of you would like to be there with him? Praise God. Let's kneel for prayer. Loving Father in heaven, I thank you so much that you have given us your laws, both spiritual and physical, so that it is for our good always, because you're trying to keep us alive, Lord. You're trying to shield us from suffering the results and consequences of sin. You're trying to keep us alive, Lord, and prosper us so that you can take us home to heaven. And Father, I just want to pray in a special way for my dear brothers and sisters here at camp meeting. I want to pray for us, Lord, that we can truly be your people, that we can not only enjoy good health for ourselves, but be an example to people around us, so that they will come to us and say, what are you doing? And how can I learn more about your God that gives you these wonderful laws and rules? And Lord, I just pray that as we enter into your Sabbath, Lord, may it be with a full commitment of allegiance to your ways. Lord, our ways have obviously led to ruin and death, Lord. We don't even know what's going to make us happy. And so, Lord, we give up our ways and ask that you would give us your ways, that we would surrender our plans, that we might embrace yours. I ask that you would bless each and every person in this room with good health, Lord, not just mentally, physically, emotionally, financially, Lord, not for themselves only, but that they might be a witness to you, and they might be able to share with others glorious blessings that you give to us. We thank you in